Ahead of what is likely to be one of the most difficult weeks in recent parliamentary history, celery is on the menu, and cauliflower, tomatoes, onions and potatoes, all imported from the EU. But we were told today a no deal does not mean shortages.
No, there will be no shortages of fresh food.
Will food prices go up, as you used to say was inevitable?
Well, I think that there are a number of economic factors in play. Some prices may go up. Other prices will come down.
The British Food Consortium said it was categorically untrue that fresh food supplies would be unaffected. However, this is the week in which there will be concerted attempts to prevent a no deal. On Tuesday, MPs return to Parliament. Attempts will then be made by those opposed to a no-deal Brexit to take control of the parliamentary timetable. If they are successful, they will introduce primary legislation forcing a delay to Brexit beyond October the 31st.
Every vote is going to count. But what Boris Johnson has done in shutting down Parliament is actually to bolster those that are against no deal. Because everybody knows the window is very, very narrow now. And this is the time, I think, for everybody to ask themselves, which side am I on in this whole no-deal Brexit discussion?
Yet even if the legislation is passed, Mr Gove this morning refused to confirm that the government would abide by it.
We see a deal coming down the line. And just as we see the light at the end of the tunnel, Keir is saying, let's have more tunnel. I do not believe that the British people want more delay, more prevarication, more denial of their original democratic verdict.
It's also reported that the Prime Minister wouldn't rule out measures to force through a no deal, including asking the Queen to refuse to give a bill royal assent. What nobody knows is if the numbers are there to get through any of this legislation. Certainly there are some high-profile Tory rebels, including the former Chancellor Philip Hammond and the former Justice Secretary David Gauke. The question is, if push comes to shove, will they vote against their government? Tomorrow they will be meeting with the Prime Minister Boris Johnson to hear what his plans are to avoid a no deal.
When are we putting forward proposals to deal with this backstop issue, which is the one issue he has identified as the problem within the withdrawal agreement? I want to hear how he's going to address that. And I want to hear how he plans to deliver the legislation, if we get a deal, by the 31st of October.
The Prime Minister has talked of signs of progress in the Brexit discussions, but today the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, once again insisted the critical Irish backstop aimed at preventing a hard border across Ireland cannot be renegotiated. So, in the meantime, preparing for October the 31st, the Cabinet Office launched this today, linking through to warnings of delays at the borders and encouraging people to renew their passports.
Victoria MacDonald reporting there. Well, one former Conservative minister opposed to leaving the EU without a deal is Alistair Burt. I spoke to him a little earlier and I began by asking him how far he would go to stop a no-deal Brexit.
I had been hoping before Parliament, before the government announced its plans on prorogation, that we would have a good bit of time between now and the European Council to debate these matters. I was certainly prepared to vote this week to reduce the conference recess in order to give us more time to do so. And I'm disappointed at the plans for prorogation, that they are so long. So I would vote to try and reduce the recess time if that's at all possible. And in the meantime, if there is an opportunity to vote to allow Parliament to have the chance to consider whether or not it wants to support no deal or wants to continue to urge the government to seek a deal, I will vote for that.
You are now considered a rebel who has apparently been threatened with deselection. I wonder what you feel about that.
Well, I find it a bit hard, really. I was someone who voted to remain in the EU, then I accepted the result of the referendum as a good Democrat. I voted consistently for the withdrawal agreement of the Prime Minister, and I noticed some current members of the Cabinet did not vote for that withdrawal agreement, and I think we're partly in the position we are in because those members of the Cabinet did not do so. And I find it a little bit hard after 32 years as a Member of Parliament, serving in every administration in some capacity or other, but this to be labelled a rebel, to be quite honest.
We've heard a senior minister this morning suggesting that the government could potentially ignore legislation passed by Parliament. What do you think about that?
Obviously troubled. I don't think government should be in that position. Government needs to accept legislation. If part of our decision to leave the EU is about Parliament taking back control, then it means what it says. And if governments get into the habit of ignoring or trying to avoid parliamentary scrutiny, well, I must say what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And it won't be just a Conservative government that will have hit upon this as an idea. We're at a very delicate stage, and I know people's feelings run very high. So we have to be careful about our language and careful about how we use parliamentary institutions because, as I say, precedents matter.
Given how uncomfortable you seem to sound over the current situation, would you be willing to bring this government down if that's what it took?
I want to support a Conservative government. I have compromised in relation to my view on the European Union to the extent of wanting to see a Conservative government succeed outside the European Union with a deal and an arrangement that is good for both of us. I want that to be the case, and I want to support a Conservative government that will do that, and I don't really want to entertain thoughts of bringing down a Conservative government.
Do you think that you can persuade the Prime Minister at all tomorrow? Because your side of the argument is essentially lost. We've got people like Dominic Cummings in charge.
Well, don't goad me. I thought we had been dealing with the issue of unelected bureaucrats in a different way. My sense is that the Prime Minister is obviously very strong-minded, but he understands both Parliament and he understands the difficulty of the negotiations he's got. I do hope he does listen. I think genuinely he wants to see a deal. I think he's got to look at the reality of whether the position he's taken or the position he is being persuaded to take is likely to get a deal or not. And even if he brings a deal back based on changes to the backstop, but with the withdrawal agreement largely in place, he needs to look at those who undermined Theresa May's government and ultimately brought it down by Conservative members who did not vote for the withdrawal agreement. There's still many of them, more than people like me, and if they're determined not to vote for the withdrawal agreement when he brings it back, then what price getting a deal at all? And I think some pressure should be put on them. They appear to be taking a position that even if the backstop is changed, they won't change their view. Why aren't they being put under some degree of pressure in order to change their position? Because that would affect things markedly.
OK, Alistair Burt, thanks very much for joining us. Alistair Burt MP speaking to me a little earlier, and within the last few minutes, Number 10 has told us it has withdrawn its offer of a meeting between the Prime Minister and a group of so-called rebel Tory MPs. Instead, the Prime Minister has offered Philip Hammond a one-to-one meeting. Number 10 cited diary pressures for the change. And to discuss the potentially turbulent week ahead, I'm joined from Kent by the broadcaster Ian Dale, who also writes for the Conservative Home website, and here in the studio, the Guardian columnist Zoe Williams. Welcome to you both, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Zoe Williams, you've been involved with these Stop the Coup protests.
Yeah.
I mean, that sort of language, there's no military tanks on the streets or a general on the TV screens. It's not a coup, is it?
I mean, actually, the main problem with the word coup was how easy it is to misspell. That was really our that was the kind of main focus of the discussions. Look, you know, a lot of Conservative commentators are talking about prorogation in terms of Parliament has been prorogued before. This is a perfectly ordinary phase of process. You know, you proles don't really understand what it means anyway. There's a kind of lot riding on that. But the truth of it is, it's not about proroguing Parliament. It's about the executive moving explicitly against Parliament in order to pass legislation which Parliament doesn't want to pass, right? So we're not really talking about the technicalities of prorogue. We're talking about an executive against Parliament.
And you're happy to call that a coup?
Well, it's absolutely extraordinary. I cannot think. People keep saying it may be slightly similar to 1931, slightly similar to 1945, but I actually can't think constitutionally of a time when the executive has been ranged against Parliament similarly since 1642, when we had a civil war.
Well, let's just put that to Ian Dale, because Ian Dale, you think we all need to just calm down a bit?
I think we do. Talks of a coup, talks of Boris Johnson being a dictator are just risible. And I think anybody outside the political geek world that Zoe and I inhabit will just see that for what it is. Yes, it is Boris Johnson getting down and dirty, using parliamentary tactics, just as the Remainers have done for the last 18 months. He signalled that he intends to leave the European Union, come what may, on October the 31st. He has got a sense of direction which Theresa May's government didn't have. Now, you can disagree with it by all means, but when you look at the parliamentary shenanigans that the Remainers have indulged in over the last 18 months, and the Speaker ignoring all precedents as well, it's, as Zoe said, what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
OK, well, I mean, you heard their parliamentary shenanigans. There are a lot of people who voted to leave who will see this as more of the same, won't they?
I mean, that's such a giant question which doesn't actually address any of its individual bits. Sorry, no offence to the question. It's
you
just,
answer it.
The point is that whether or not people voted and knowing that there would be a no deal, which is incredibly contestable, you know, did all the major figures in government now, principally Johnson and Gove, explicitly said there was no chance of no deal during the campaign, explicitly said a deal would be very easily come by. And so the idea that you can just say, well, the will of the people is that we leave with no deal, based on an election in which no deal was never mentioned, is just silly. It's preposterous. It doesn't even make sense within its own scheme. Furthermore, the idea that parliamentarians have been engaging in shenanigans or, you know, in technical fixes is simply untrue. What has happened in Parliament is people have discussed what's on the table and said, I don't like the look of it. And that's what Parliament is there for. You know, so you can say nobody deserves any scrutiny. We just need one strong leader to do everything, in which case you're actually not talking about a democracy, you're talking about a completely different sort of government. Or you say, how does Parliament scrutinise?
Okay.
That's what Parliament's been doing.
Well, let me bring Ian Dale back in. Look, Ian, this is about parliamentary scrutiny. We heard earlier today a government minister saying potentially the government could ignore a law passed by Parliament. Do you think we should calm down about that too?
Well, just before I answer that, Zoe seems to forget that in March 2017, MPs voted by 4-1 to trigger Article 50. And they knew then that if we didn't get a deal at the end of the 2-year period, we would be leaving with no deal. So no deal is no surprise, or it ought not to be, to MPs who voted for it. Now, on the Michael Gove thing, I noticed that you didn't actually play any clip where Michael Gove said anything like that. I've just finished watching the Michael Gove interview, and I think you've interpreted that in a, well, shall we say, a very elastic way. I think it would be wholly unthinkable for a government to ignore a law that Parliament has passed. However, what you do then, if you can't get your own legislation through Parliament, or if Parliament has taken control and put its own law through Parliament, then you call a general election. That is the constitutional way out of this. And some people actually suspect that that is what Boris Johnson wants to do all along.
So this is all game playing, is it?
Well, you can call it game playing all you like, but in the end, he will do whatever he thinks is right to get us out of the European Union on the 31st of October. We talk a lot about, Zoe talked about the executive against Parliament. What she didn't say was Parliament against the people, because Parliament has, over the last 3.5 years, gone out of its way to frustrate any movement out of the EU, and it will continue to do so. All of these people who talk about scrutiny, what they actually mean is thwarting Brexit. They want to actually stop Brexit. Zoe will be honest about that, because that's what she wants to do. But most of the MPs, they don't actually say that.
OK, thanks. Zoe, do you think we're heading for a constitutional crisis?
That's really silly. Can I just answer that first?
Well, can you answer my question? Do you think we're
I'm going to
heading for a
answer you
constitutional crisis?
So in terms of a constitutional crisis, I think you're right. I think it is a bit of gameplay. I don't think they want a constitutional crisis. I don't think they do want to ignore the law. I think what they're trying to do is get a general election, but get the Labour Party to force it, because Boris Johnson clearly, having said there would be no general election, doesn't want to be the person to call one. So I think you know, in a sense, Ian's right. We shouldn't take it too seriously, because it is just, you know, kind of quite typical, quite dishonest political gameplay. But on the other hand, I think there will be residual constitutional problems raised by the behaviour so far.
Right, we're going to have to stop this behaviour for now.